Thank you very much for taking the time to attend the public lecture in the Faculty of Science, and welcome to all of you guys. My name is Pristine van Vuren. I am appointed in the Zoology Department in the Faculty of Science, and a large part of my work essentially focuses on biodiversity in the Antarctic and the subantarctic region, and that's what I actually want to talk to you about today. It's not so much a science lecture as it's a more public lecture, more interesting stories with some pretty pictures. First of all, I would like to start with some acknowledgements, because this kind of work is not possible without working in a large group. So some of the acknowledgements there, some of the work is done in collaboration with the Australian Antarctic Division. A lot of the work is funded through the South African National Antarctic Program. And the mission of the South African National Antarctic Program is essentially to increase our understanding of the natural environment and life in the Antarctic and subantarctic region. And that's really what the program itself is doing. So SANAP, the abbreviation for it, SANAP, essentially manages 3 different islands. And those islands are a continent, Antarctica, the Prince Edward Islands, and Gough Island, which is part of the Tristan da Cunha group. Just to show you, or before that, let me just explain to you that what essentially happens is that there's relief voyages where the South African polar vessel goes down to Antarctica, to Marion Island, and to Gough Island, and the idea is that it takes supply down for a year, but it also takes the overwintering team down. And in that short 3, 4, 5 weeks that the ship is actually based at the island, it also takes relief staff or relief personnel down, which then they do not stay the whole year, but they essentially conduct research in that short period. For Antarctica, the boat essentially departs, and it's now often in the news also. The boat departs somewhere in November, back in February. Then in April to May is the time that the boat goes to Marion. That's the only time. It's not like there's 3 boats per day. That's essentially when you go. April to May, and then Gough Island or Tristan da Cunha is September to October. So you'll see that the ship is out quite a bit doing this kind of work. Just to show you where these different places are, if you can orientate from Cape Town, which is there, Antarctica, the Sunlight Station in Antarctica, approximately 2,400 kilometers south. The Prince Edward Islands, about 1,200 kilometers away from Cape Town. And then the Tristan da Cunha group, or Gough Island, essentially 1,400 kilometers away. So just to show you where these places are. Okay, so as I've explained, South Africa has a permanent presence at all of these, the 2 islands and Antarctica as well, which means that there's always South African citizens present in the base. Now, who actually goes down? For Antarctica, there's a doctor, 2 diesel mechanics, several engineers, also senior weather people. Essentially, remember that our weather, most of the research there is actually related to weather, and then also to physicists that spend essentially the whole year in Antarctica. The islands, again, some guys from the Weather Bureau, 2 medical orderlies essentially go down, a radio technician, a diesel mechanic, and then some field assistants that stay the year as well. So just to give you an idea, if you wanted to go to Antarctica for a year, if you're a mechanical, electronic engineer, or you work for the Weather Bureau, you've got a very good chance to be on the team that go down. What kind of research is actually done in these areas? So for Antarctica, there's a lot of physical sciences, earth sciences, and a little bit of life sciences. Remember, Antarctica, for almost half of the year, it's completely dark. Half of the year, the sun never sets. So in the summertime, when the boat is there, when the relief takes place, the sun shines all the time. I think it sets for about an hour or so. But for a large part of the time that you're there, it's completely dark. So biologists don't really go down and spend the whole year, because for 6 or 7 months they'll do nothing, they can't go out, they sit in the boats. Marion Island, a lot of biological type research is done there. I've just listed some of them. Pretoria University's got a project on seals and killer whales. The Fitzpatrick Institute studies seabirds there. They look at weather, of course, interaction between marine and terrestrial environment. So there's a lot of biological research on Marion Island, similar on Gough Island, where the focus is largely on birds. Okay, now some interesting facts about these 3 places. Let's start with Antarctica. Antarctica is essentially the coldest and one of the driest places on Earth. The lowest temperature that's ever been recorded on Earth was actually measured at the Russian station, the Vostok station, in 1983, minus 90 degrees. That's the lowest natural temperature ever measured on Earth in Antarctica. The hottest temperature ever measured is 14 degrees on the continent. Okay? This is a cold place. It's also very dry. It's essentially a desert. Even though there's a lot of snow, there's no water. The water is frozen. It's in snow. So it's essentially a desert. Approximately 166 millimeters of rainfall or precipitation per year. It never rains. Marion Island is about, as you've seen, 2,200 kilometers south of Cape Town. It's located in what is called the Roaring Forties. Now, what the Roaring Forties actually refers to is essentially westerly winds between 40 and 50 latitudes south. It's just hailing gale force winds all the time. And that's essentially the belt where Marion Island is located. Both Marion and Gough Island has got what we call an oceanic climate. What that means is it's a very small bit of land in an ocean. So the ocean essentially dictates the climate on the island. So the climate is very, very stable. There's no huge fluctuations in temperature. The average temperature on Marion Island is 5 degrees almost every day. You know, what's the temperature going to be today? 5. What's the temperature tomorrow? 5. Every day 5. It can fluctuate a little bit. There are some sunny days up to 20 degrees. Coldest days about -7, but on average 5 degrees. Average rainfall 2,500 millimeters. Think about this. This is 2.5 meters of rain that falls every year on the island. That's a lot of rain. Gough Island is more. That's 3,100 millimeters per year. So these places are really incredibly wet. Gough Island is not as far south. It's about at 40 latitudes south. So it's not that far south. So the average temperature is a little bit warmer. But remember, it's still very much dictated by the ocean around it. So the ocean keeps the temperature very stable. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the South African research or the polar vessels. So it's called the S.A. Gallus. The first S.A. Gallus was essentially, they started building in 1977, and the ship has just been decommissioned. It's been handed over to the Navy. Essentially, the reason for that is that the ship has to go down to Antarctica. So the hull has to be strengthened to break ice. So it's not an icebreaker per se, but the hull is essentially strengthened, and because the first S.A. Gallus was 30 years old, a little bit more than 30 years, the hull was not considered strong enough to go down to Antarctica anymore. So it's now part of the Navy. They use it to train Marines. The length is about 112 meters, 18 meters wide. Now 112 meters sound very long, but let me tell you, if you're sitting on that boat for day in and day out, 112 meters becomes a very small space. Okay? So it sounds very big. It's not. It is big, but if you know, on that boat for days at end, it's not that long. Maximum speed about 14 knots. The SAO Gullis was then commissioned, and they started the building of that in 2011. It's just been taken into operations. It's just so it's not the SAO Gullis 1, but it's the SAO Gullis 2. The cost to build it was essentially 1.3 billion rand. Very expensive, but our new research vessel or polar vessel is really a state of the art. It's got onboard laboratories, very nice cabins and things to stay in, so a very big improvement on the older boat. Just to show you some pictures, this is essentially where the captain spends most of his time. This is the bar, where people essentially spend a lot of time on the boat. What happens when the research boat or the vessel goes down to these islands? The first thing that we have to always think about is that we're actually moving propagules around. We're moving species around. So in your pocket, under your shoes, in the Velcro of your bag, there's seeds. If you just sat on the lawn outside, there's potentially seeds from there. Lots of people use the same backpack to go to Melville Koppies over the weekend, and they then take it down to the islands and to Antarctica as well. So we're actually moving species around that can potentially establish on the islands and become invasive species, or in the least become alien species. So what we have on the boat about 2 or 3 days outside of Cape Town is what they call a boot washing ceremony. Everybody takes their bags, their clothes, their shoes down, and you physically scrub it with a very strong detergent to get rid of all the seeds and all the chogos and things that you might be carrying around. So that's big entertainment. Okay, what we also do is on the heli deck at the back of the ship, we sometimes play touch rugby or things like that. Spend a lot of time in the lounge, just sitting around watching movies. In the evening the bar opens and people just socialize. Okay, not much to do on the boat unless you are an oceanographer. Then you just work like crazy all the time. Okay, let's start with Antarctica. A little bit of history. So in 1959, Norway essentially announced that they were going to evacuate their base in Antarctica called Norway Base in Queen Maud Land. I'll show you now where it is. At the end of the International Geophysical Year, which was 1959, one of them. So on the 1st of December of that same year, South Africa was one of the first signatories of the Antarctic Treaty. Now that's a convention or an agreement between countries that's still in place today. And it essentially governs what we do. You're not allowed to build a hotel in Antarctica. Where does that come from? From the Antarctic Treaty, essentially. So South Africa was one of the first countries, with Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, you can read there, the USA and the Soviet Union at that point, to actually sign this treaty. So what we then did was we actually took over the base from Norway. So in that first year, in 1959, a few days after we signed the treaty, the first South African team, the South African National Antarctic Expedition Team, went down and they stayed in this Norway base in Antarctica. And that guy was the first team leader that actually went down. So this is essentially Antarctica. Cape Town is somewhere there to the north. So this area here, which is closest to Cape Town, is called Queen Maud Land, and that's where the South African base is. So the South African base is essentially there. There's the German base, Neumayer. The UK's got 2 bases, Halley and Rotifera, essentially on the peninsula and one on the continent. There's the base where Argentina spends a lot of their research. The United States, 2 stations. New Zealand's got 1 base, Scott base. That, by the way, there's the South Pole. Okay. That's the Frenchies. Australia, 3 different research stations in Antarctica. Russia, a whole bunch, but all along that side. China's got one, Japan's got one, India's got one, and then we're back to the South African base. Here's a question for you, a trivial pursuit question that you can tell your parents today. What time, so the South Pole, the base at the South Pole, is essentially on all of these different time zones. What time do they hold, or, what time is it in Scott base? What country or what time zone do they follow? New Zealand, because a lot of their restocking is done from New Zealand. So they essentially, their time is New Zealand time. Okay? Tell your children or your grandparents too. Right. Let me tell you about the South African bases. So the South African base is also called SANA, which stands for the South African National Antarctic Expedition. So those are the bases. The first three bases in Sinai was built, after we occupied the Norwegian station, we essentially started building our own base. First one, 1962, 71, 79. Okay? A high turnover of bases, and the reason for that is that these three bases were all built on an ice shelf, which is essentially a moving ice shelf. So it was buried not only under the snow and the ice, but also as the ice shelves broke off, bits of icebergs break off from the continent, we essentially lost some of the bases like that. What then happened was they started building Sinai 4 they moved into it in 1997. And this really was actually engineering history. It was built on stilts. So instead of saying, okay, the ice moves up as the ice is laid down, we can only occupy a station for a couple of years, they actually built it on stilts. And not only did they build it on stilts, but they also did it so that you can raise it. And that's what a lot of the countries are now doing when they are building their new stations. So they're essentially following what we did in Antarctica. They also moved the station about 220 kilometers inland from the ocean, from the cliffs, the ice cliffs right on the side of the continent. And they built it on a nunatak. So a nunatak is not ice, but it's actually a piece of rock. So they built it on rock, quite a bit away from the continental shelf. So what happens when the SAO Gallus arrives at the continental shelf? Where the boat or the ship essentially docks, the ice wall or the ice shelf can be up to 40 meters high, so it's very high. So what they do is the ship, basically the Gallus pushes up against it, they with a crane put some people onto the ice shelf, as well as some of these caterpillars and dozers, and then they push a ramp down so that they can start offloading some of the cargo. So they physically, this is at the moment now. Remember, the base is 220 kilometers away from where the boat stops. So they offload the cargo onto the continental shelf. That's just another picture. So the boat, the SAO Gallus pushes up against the continental shelf. They doze a ramp, which is what's happening there. That's very scary, because that can break off. The ice can break there anytime. And then the poor guy in that dozer is at the bottom of the ocean within a couple of seconds. So they really, you must see those guys when they get off, when they finish dozing, it's like, and they then essentially offload the cargo. Now, if you are lucky, then you fly to Sinai. That takes about an hour. Okay? If you are unlucky, then you go by caterpillar train. That takes about 20 hours. You sit on this thing and you just boom, boom, boom along at whatever, 2 or 3 or how many ever kilometers an hour. Okay? Now, this is a biology lecture, so think about it. This is what you see. Now, if you have to go to the bathroom, there's no bathroom. So everybody stops and you get off and you do what you have to do. But this is interesting stuff, okay? Also, you can't just leave it there. So each person is given X number of bags that you then close and you put in a bin afterwards. You can't just, remember, this is pristine gold. There's nothing there. This is not Everest where there's so much rubbish that you can't, there's no clean ice anymore. This is one of the most pristine places on Earth. You leave nothing behind. Okay, this is the South African bus. It's essentially three double-story units that are linked together, each about 44 meters. It's raised at the moment 3.5 meters above the ice, but we can raise it again one more time, so lift the stilts again. As you can see, it's actually built on the stilts. It accommodates about 20 overwintering staff year-round, and about additional 60 staff during the takeover period. Remember, that's why the engineers and the mechanics that go down are so important, because all your heat comes from the diesel engines that generate heat. Those engines go out, you are dead within a couple of hours. So nothing can go wrong, because it really is a life and death situation. Just some more pictures of, so this is essentially the Nurmata Vesleeskrabat, where the base is built on. A few years ago you would have heard that a guy, just a few days after they arrived, they drove off the cliff on one of those skidoos, those snowmobiles. They essentially just went straight over. Because it's ice, it's very deceptive. You don't see depth. So you don't see that this is the end of the cliff like what you would see if you actually go and walk in the mountains or something. He just went straight over. Okay. Where do we get water? What you basically do is there's a big burner and you just shovel snow, which is then heated, and there's water for the base. Okay? Although there's a lot of snow, it's a lot of effort to have water. So what they usually do, especially if the water runs low, is they ask people, not to have a bath or a shower every day, to try and miss some days, just to conserve water. Another picture there of the base. Life at the base, this is the entrance hall. Welcome to Sunlight 4. This is essentially the store where a lot of the skidoo parts and mechanical parts are kept. Food store, remember, the boat drops you and there goes the boat. Coming back next year this time. So there's food for a year. Okay, there's no shop where you buy. When you go down, you take whatever you will need for 1 year. Okay, this is the medical facilities. They do everything from emergency operations to fixing teeth to whatever is required. Very well-stocked medical rooms. Entertainment, this is the library, this is one of the bars or the lounges essentially in the base. So it's very well equipped. Just another pretty picture. Essentially you'll see these rocky outcrops with snow in between. Okay. Biodiversity around Sinai. This is it. Okay. There's no, because the ice shelf, because it's A, so far inland, plus B, because the ice shelf on our side is so high, seals and things like that they don't come out there. But if you then go to the other side where the New Zealand base is, or to the peninsula, there's a lot of diversity. A Weddell seal, a black-billed albatross, a Dede penguin, which is the favorite food of the leopard seal, emperor penguins, which are essentially this high, more or less. Antarctic shirk, rockhopper penguins, elephant seal. What's wrong with this? Okay, why do ice bears not eat, polar bears not eat penguins? Because they are at the North Pole and not the South Pole. Okay? They are not there. Okay, this is just a little bit about the geology. So Antarctica itself, the East Antarctic, is essentially a solid block of continent covered with ice. At the West Antarctic, or West Antarctica side, is very few solid land with a lot of ice, actually. So it's completely different. And if we then look at this reconstruction of Antarctica, here's the peninsula. So basically the peninsula, South America is just there. There you go. Then these are two of the biggest ice shelves. And what you can then see, if we think about climate warming, is essentially that the continent itself, believe it or not, is cooling and not heating up. The continent itself, the temperatures are actually decreasing. What's increasing is the temperature on the peninsula. So of all the water that the ice that melts in Antarctica, 55% comes from that small area, with only 15% coming from the two largest ice shelves. Antarctica itself, the temperatures are actually in a lot of the areas cooling and not heating up. That's climate change. It's not really global warming, it's a change in the climate. Antarctica was not always cold. Remember that as a continent, it was part of Gondwana land. So once upon a time, it was actually a warm, temperate area. So a lot of the fossils that we find there are actually warm, temperate fossils. But with the opening of the Drake Passage, which essentially connects the tip of Antarctica with the tip of South America, when that opened, the Antarctic circumpolar current started forming about 30 million years ago. That's the strongest and the largest current that we actually have on Earth today. And Antarctica slowly started moving south, so the current plus the south movement of Antarctica, the continent, essentially caused it to cool down. Today there's about 550 non-marine invertebrate taxa on Antarctica. This sounds like a lot, but it's a lot less than what you would find in the North Pole. And that's because the land-to-water ratio in the southern hemisphere is very different to the northern hemisphere. So even in the northern hemisphere, there's essentially a 1-to-1 ratio between land and water. But in the southern hemisphere, there's 15 water for every 1 part land. So it's very different. Okay, so the second, or the first island then, the second topic is essentially Marion Island. And this is where I do the majority of my research. This is the new base on Marion Island. Okay? Politically, Marion Island falls under Cape Town. So it actually falls under the magisterial district of Cape Town. Marion and Prince Edward Island together make up the Prince Edward Islands. Prince Edward is very pristine. Marion Island, not so much. There's a lot of introduced and invasive species on it. Prince Edward, people just don't go there. They see it, but we don't go there. Marion Island, there's people all year round. That's essentially a weather station. A lot of the weather information comes from there. Highest peak on Marion is about 1,200 meters. That's more or less Table Mountain. It's been declared a special nature reserve as well, which means you can't build a hotel there. These islands are volcanic islands. They're essentially the tip of shield volcanoes, and Marion Island is approximately 500,000 years old. So when you stand on Marion Island, 19 kilometers away, you'll actually on a nice day see Prince Edward Island. So you can see the other island, the second island in the group, but we just don't go there. We keep it pristine. This is just a reconstruction of Marion Island. The base is essentially here. This is the highest peak, so it really is just a nice little cupcake. Up until a few years ago, there was a permanent ice sheet on the interior of Marion Island. Because the temperatures increased so much, there's no more permanent ice on Marion Island. So there's a huge change in climate change there. What happens when the boat arrives, essentially, is that all the cargo and the people are offloaded via helicopter. Cargo is packed in these containers and they're just flown off the ship and put down and everybody unpacks. What's in here? Food and drink for a year for the overwintering team, plus all the equipment and stuff that we, temporary visitors actually take with. So for the first couple of days, we just offloaded. What happened quite recently was that we actually started building a new base. The old base was just too old and it was really falling apart. So this is the old base, essentially, with some of the labs outside. That's the Burda lab, that's the Gough lab, which essentially is where we did a lot of our work. And that's the sealers up there, where mostly the University of Pretoria guys that run the seal project, that was their lab. And then this is the main lab. This is the new base that was built, that we actually now occupying when we go down. And they're starting to decommission the old lab. So the old base. The idea is that they'll remove everything, so that there's nothing there and allow the area to go back to what it used to be before we built the base there. Okay. Now, these subantarctic islands, once upon a time, was actually a terrible place, because that's where the sealers went to hunt seals to get oil and things like that. So this is just a small, under the cliffs where they put some wood together and made a small hut in there where they actually stayed. This is a beach that's relatively close to base. It's called Tripod Beach. And the reason is because this old pot is still there where they used to boil get the oil from and the fat from the seals. Okay? Now, there are no trees on Marion Island. Everything is sopping wet. There's nothing that can burn. They used penguins as fuel. So they actually burnt the penguins to get the heat to get the fat and the oil from the seals. And those in the back are the elephant seals, which are the ones that they were really actually hunting. And this happened on a lot of these subantarctic islands. And in fact, that's where a lot of the introduced species comes from those old sealers that used to go down in the 1800s and so. This is Marion Island, the base is very important, the bar. This is still the old base. Okay, the bar, you'll see there's some entertainment on the wall. Remember, you stay there, a group of 10 people for a year. Okay, this is your family. This is one of the labs. Here's the food store, so you'll see there's lots of food that are actually unpacked and stored. This is the new base, again, absolutely state-of-the-art. Some of the new laboratories. This is the dining hall in the new base, and just a view when you're actually walking, how you can look out of the window. So it's essentially glass windows all around. Very, very nice base at the moment. It's even a jacuzzi, believe it or not. Okay, which a lot of scientists are very unhappy about. This is a field toilet, essentially again, because what you can do is you can also walk around the island and stay in different field huts. So each hut has got its own facility, and this is a picture of one of those. Amazing views, really. Okay. Remember, Marion Island, as a lot of the subantarctic islands, is actually a volcanic island. So when you walk, what you can see is young black lava, the older grey lava, and then in the front here some of the cinder cone scoria, like red, very porous rocks. So Marion Island is a volcanic island. And in fact, the recent volcanic eruption was a couple of years ago. Not a major one, but certainly some lava and some smoke. So still an active volcano. This is just looking down, some king penguins there, big elephant seals here, and you can see this is about the only sandy beach on Marion Island, tripod, sand incredibly black. Again, volcanic island. This is, if you stand just behind the base and you look inland, what you essentially see here is some drier areas with agrostis grass. You also find this genus in South Africa here. Some fern breaks, and then if you look in, this is a scoria corn, and if you look in, that's the highest peaks up there, which is essentially a polar desert. There's a couple of vegetation types for the botanists amongst us. For example, some subantarctic kelp beds. There's a whole couple of these vegetation types defined for Marion Island. This is subantarctic foulfield vegetation, which is essentially cushion plant, azorella. Some agrostis on it, on a lot of these black lava outcrops. Essentially, this is an interesting story. What happened a couple of years ago, in 2002, is a Frenchie, a frog, decided that he was going to build his plane and fly around the Earth on solar. So he was actually on his way to McMurdo Station in Antarctica. He didn't realize that as it gets colder, the ice actually builds up on the wings and the plane becomes heavier. So he realized he would run out of fuel. Radioed, and they said, well, the closest land really is Marion Island. So he said, okay, great, there must be like a runway. So they radioed ahead and said, okay, emergency landing planes coming in. And the radio tech said, there's no runway. This is essentially Maya. Where, either Maya or rocks. What is he going to do? They said, there's no turning back, he's coming. So they ran out and they looked for a flat area, which really is a Maya. I mean, it's like when you walk there, you sort of walk like this, because you try and move your way very quickly, because if you stand, you just... We took a professor down from Lazzo Messina, from Stellenbosch. He went out for the first 4 days, and he just spent all his time this deep stuck, and then he didn't go out. So, the Maya shuffle is actually very important. But this guy then landed in November. Then he said, okay, now he wants to go home for Christmas, and they said that the boat is coming. The boat's coming in April. So basically you can read up on that. That's an interesting story. This is when the relief voyage actually did come and they picked up the flight. So of course it just stuck its nose and tipped over, and he was actually okay. Thank goodness. Right. A lot of the flights on the island is done by helicopter. Well, it is. If you don't walk, you fly. This was a day sometime towards the end of April where we actually dropped some geomorphologists off in the polar desert on the ice plateau. So this is just a picture that I took through the window with the pilots here on the front. These are the geomorphologists from Rhodes University. When we dropped them off that day, the temperature with the wind chill is about minus 25. And then they camp there for a day or two and then come back to base after that. This is a paddy, which is essentially an endemic bird to a lot of those islands. This is my bag, so you get issued with warm gloves and things, and they're like chickens. But they're very curious, so they're always pecking around at your boots and under your feet and so on. This is me sitting on I was actually photoshopped a tin of coconut, but this is me sitting on that black beach. These are some of the penguins. So you can see you're issued with gumboots. That's the only way that you move around the island because you're always in the water. So gumboots, wet pants, jacket. It's cold, so I keep my ears warm. We have Antarctic and subantarctic fur seals on the island. They're actually very beautiful, but they do chase you. They can be quite aggressive. This is wandering albatross. They're monogamous. They mate for life. Okay, and they always come back. They build nests, so this is part of their mating. What they then do, or their courtship behavior, they build a nest essentially, and for a year the chick sits on the nest. So from the egg until it's this massive albatross. Remember, this is the bird with the longest wingspan. What happens when it fledges or flies is it goes out onto the ocean for about a couple of years, 3, 4, 5, 6 years before it comes back to land. So for 6 or so odd years, it'll just spend on the ocean soaring or sitting on the water, and then it comes back to land. Basically sits on the nest. Marion Island's been glaciated a couple of times during the past. This picture is just the island, and the green of the blue is now how we understand the last glacial maximum, where the extent of the ice was. In terms of geology, very interesting, of course. Rhodes University is doing a lot of research on Marion Island there. There's a lineament that we recently described along that area, and then I couldn't help it, but I have to bring in some genetics. If you then look at the genetics of some of these invertebrate species, you can see that it's actually driven very much, if these are the 3 different genetic groups that we picked up around the island, by the lineament. So that right there is exactly this lineament or geological structure that we found on the island. And this, in fact, is for a flightless moth, Brimbiophobia. Okay, last one, Gough Island. Gough Island is one of 4 islands in the Tristan da Cunha group, which essentially lies halfway between us and South America. 4 islands, Tristan da Cunha, about 1 million years old, Inaccessible Island, approximately 6, Nightingale, 18 million years, Gough Island, approximately 3 million years, but it's quite a bit to the south, a day by boat, by ship, as these things go. Gough Island itself is a basaltic shield volcano, again a volcanic island. It's part of a midriff or mid-Atlantic ridge, so there's a couple of islands that come through the Azores as well, for example. It's part of that same group of islands, or part of the volcanic ridge there. The highest peak is about 910. What's interesting is that Gough Island actually belongs to Britain. It's a UK island. And we've got a 50-year lease, which is just expired, but it was renewed, because that's where our weather comes from. It's again a meteorological station, so that's where our weather comes from. Gough Island falls under the administrator of Tristan da Cunha. He sits on the island. It's a wildlife reserve, it's a strict nature reserve under the IUCN, and it's also a World Heritage Site. Like I said, South Africa signed a 50-year lease. Okay? So what happens essentially as part of this lease is that once a year, when the Algalas goes to Gough, is we have to take supplies to Tristan. There's about 300 people that permanently live on Tristan. Comes from only 7 families. The short of it is that during the Second World War, because of the strategic location of the island, it was actually annexed by the UK, by Britain. They put some soldiers there. At the end of the war, they of course never saw any action, but at the end of the war, all the soldiers went back to Britain except 7. They said they love it here, they would like to stay. but they would like some wives. So 7 wives was brought in from Cape Town. For the 7 soldiers, this is a true story. And all the people today on the island essentially comes, so there's 7 surnames. One of those surnames is Greek. Okay? This is so big, so part of it, what we have to do is we take supplies down to Tristan. We take a doctor down and we take visitors down. We drop them off. We then go to Gough. The end of the trip, we come back and we take them, we pick them up and we bring them back to Cape Town. So it's a nice little town. This could be anywhere in the British countryside. All the cargo is offloaded by barges. So we take the cargo off and they take it back onto the land. The first couple of years they offloaded the booze. On the first day, never again, because then for 3 days nobody comes to work. So now they drink, the containers with the drink is actually offloaded last. Okay, this is Gough Island, the station on Gough Island. Even though Gough Island is also one of these sub-Antarctic islands, it's quite a bit more to the north. So the vegetation is not quite moss and ferns and things like that. It's quite a bit high, and it's actually a very dangerous island. People get lost there quite often. This is the station. These are some of the girders, a lot of cliffs as well. It's not a nice, gentle afternoon walk. It's actually quite difficult to move around on Gough Island. Some of the ferns there are actually amazing. They say of all the places, this is the most beautiful island. This is the Gough bunting, which is endemic to the area, critically endangered because of mouse predation. So the sealers, when they were sealing there, introduced mouse. Terrible. Because the birds there have no natural defense against these mice predation. You know, so here, if a mouse starts eating you, you would get up or kick it or walk away or something like that. The birds there simply don't know it. So the mice literally eat these birds alive, essentially. Here's a picture of a mouse with what's left of a bird. This is a picture of an albatross chick. So they eat them from behind. In the front, they will peck at them wherever they can reach. But they literally just eat them alive. And then after all of this, even though it's amazing, the nicest sight coming back is Table Mountain. And then you're back home. So I want to end off with this. We are really at a critical juncture for the conservation and study of biological diversity. It's now or never. We need to conserve and save, protect our environments now, or it's essentially lost forever. Thank you very much.